Hello and welcome to our second video in our Identity and Access Management 101 Quickly Explained series. My name is Tarun Guhanand. I am a Senior Solution Strategist for Ra Technologies, and today we're going to tell you a little bit about authorization. Before we begin, let's reiterate who the audience is for this series. It's going to be your beginners in the identity and access management space, your decision makers who are looking for a quick start, or anyone with a general interest in identity or security. That being said, let's jump right into what authorization or AuthZ actually is. So if you'll recall from our last video, we talked a little bit about authentication being the process of determining the veracity of a person, a device, or an identity. Basically, making sure that someone or something is who they in fact say they are. Authorization is the second step in the overall process of utilizing an identity for some kind of purpose within an application or service. Authorization allows you to determine exactly what an authenticated party is allowed/authorized to access. Now, sticking with our driver's license example from the authentication part of the series, authorization plays into driver's licenses in a very similar way. After a user can be authenticated, as in you verify who someone is during a traffic stop by looking at their driver's license and then looking at that person's face, you can also then verify that they're actually qualified to be driving the vehicle that you've pulled them over in as a police officer. So what they look at is the class of the license. So in general, most licenses are C-class, and that is the most common kind, which means that you can drive anything under 25,000 pounds. And that is the scope, which is what the class is. And that tells you that anybody who holds a Class C license is authorized to drive vehicles with a weight that is less than or equal to 25,000 pounds. So now, extending the authorization concept to technology environments, authorization typically relies on predefining your scopes and permissions in both the end-user facing service that an identity is trying to access and actually do something in, as well as defining it within the identity provider or on the authorization server level. So by doing so, you're able to create user experiences that are tied to permission sets, so that whenever you have an administrator logging into an application, they have a different experience versus when you have a user who is just an end user signing into an application. They'll see different modules, they'll see different data, they'll see all kinds of different stuff based on how you've permissioned the application for a given set of scopes or for a given set of roles, whatever that might be. Typically, an application or service is going to be integrated with an identity provider very tightly in such a way that the permission sets that you've mapped within the service match almost exactly in nomenclature and structure to the permissions that you have within an authorization server tied to an identity provider. And an authorization server generally issues those permissions and scopes in the form of an access token, which is an encrypted token that is utilized on your client-side server for an end-user service to generate some type of user experience based on the scopes and claims presented to that service from the authorization server in the form of the access token. So AuthZ and AuthZ follow a industry-wide standard. There's two. One is the OpenID Connect standard, or OIDC, for authentication, and the OAuth 2.0 standard for authorization. So OpenID Connect basically allows clients to perform end-user authentication using the authn process that is performed with an authorization server. And OAuth is a AuthZ framework that just allows you to kind of leverage that authentication process post authentication to request access tokens. Well, technically you have to request a code, and then you receive an access token when you present that code to the authorization server, which then provides all your scopes and permissions, etc., to your end user application for a given identity. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the typical authorization flow. A colleague of mine actually published an article very recently that goes into multiple different scenarios that cover authorization in pretty decent detail. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to stick to one authorization scenario, which is the authorization code flow, which is basically a grant type that's requesting an authorization code from an identity provider's authorization server. And in this flow, you're looking at three things being involved, right? It's going to be your user, it's going to be your application, and it's going to be your identity provider. And your identity provider, as we stated before, is going to have a user database. It's going to have an authorization server either built in, or it's going to be in a different module, but it's going to be tightly linked together. And it's going to be tightly integrated with your application, and it's going to be tightly integrated with your user experience as a whole. Now, what this looks like, a user is going to log in to an application. Well, first they're going to visit the application's page, or they're going to visit it on their mobile phone, and the application is going to make a call out to an identity provider, and then they're going to authenticate with a username, password. Maybe they get prompted for a multi-factor code. Once that full authentication process is done, we're assuming that the user has successfully logged into the identity provider and thereby successfully logged into the application. After said login has occurred, the application is then going to use that authentication to request a code, an authorization code. You can see that in the response type that's requested in this GET, and it's asking for a code. It pushes the client ID from the application, and it also has a referring audience. And this is really important because your access token and your initial request will share the same audience. And we'll break down what the access token looks like briefly right after we go through the flow. But this is the first thing that happens right after a user successfully authenticates. Your service is going to push for pulling down a authorization code. Your identity provider verifies that the request is valid, and then it's going to return a 302 with an authorization code that can be used by the application in the next step to then post that authorization code and request that you get, an access token, a refresh token, and an ID token. So that's what your identity provider will issue as a result of the application providing the code on behalf of the user. It's going to give you back a 200 with a access token as stated, a refresh token that is going to be used to renew your session and issue a new access token should the first access token expire. And the access token, by the way, as we stated, is what has all your permissions and your scopes and what the user can actually do. And also, typically, you get an ID token. And this ID token will contain your typical user information. This is going to be your first name, last names, your email, phone number, basic details about a user. Generally, you shouldn't set up an identity provider to key off of those details to create any type of access or user experience within an application. You can use it to, render, first name and last name, and you have those messages that say welcome such and such. Or when you go to your profile page, it shows you all your details. It's pulling it from that ID token that's within the session to then show it on your end user facing application. So once you've gotten all those things, you can use a refresh token to obviously call new access tokens. You can set expiries on access tokens. You can set expiries on refresh tokens as well. And there's a bunch of stuff you can do with session management with these two tokens. But that's the basic authorization code flow. And this is what your typical access token looks like, right? It's encrypted, but we're just breaking it out now for structure. But generally, this is a JOT token that is fully encrypted in 256. And you're looking at certain scopes that are contained here, and it's going to have the same audience as your initial request. And it's going to have scopes like this. So you'll have like read access to certain things, write access, and these can all look different. It's really based on how it's structured in the end user application. You can make these look however you need to satisfy a particular requirement. So if you're looking for a more detailed look at authorization, as I said before, we have a very detailed article that was published by a colleague of mine in regards to authorization, and that goes through a lot of the scenarios that you're going to see and some of the benefits and drawbacks of implementing certain scenarios and where things should be used in your authorization flows to set it up as best fits the scenario that you're looking to achieve. So the link will be in the description below. But apart from that, we will catch you guys in our next video in this series, where we're probably going to break down a few more uses of access tokens, ID tokens, and refresh tokens, and also talk a little bit about multi-factor authentication. But that's all for me right now. We'll catch you on the next one.